in the 19th century, there was originated a worldview, and it extended over the better part of the 20th century, a narrative of prehistory that has assumed dominance among scholars, historians, and archaeologists. And this worldview holds that a long period of barbarism extending back tens of thousands of years gave way to the first rudiments of civilization in various places and at various times around the planet between about 4,500 and 8,000 years ago. History itself is considered to have begun with the invention of writing in the Middle East between about 4,500 and 5,000 years ago. What in the way of human patterns of life preceded these various manifestations of culture, which have ultimately led to the emergence of modern industrial, technological, and scientifically literate world that we now inhabit, is an open question. What is, however, increasingly evident is that the story of prehistory is much deeper and more complex than was recognized or acknowledged even just a generation or two ago. Of course, there have always been for decades, this core of mavericks, crackpots, and eccentrics, if you want to call them that, who've speculated that prehistory was not a closed system of stagnant cultural development, limited to a preponderance of foraging, nomadic hunting and gathering, but rather one that preserved remnants of a higher order of society, or even of civilization and scientific achievement. Then was allowed within the entrenched paradigms of antiquity that were held or have been held so emphatically by academics and those self-appointed gatekeepers of the human past on planet Earth. To preserve their dominion, these caretakers of the orthodox narrative must exclude from acknowledgement an ever-growing mass of evidence that severely contradicts the simple picture of prehistoric savagery and primitivism that has held sway over scientific thinking for more than a century. But despite the efforts of mainstream scholars to obstruct the advancement of an alternative paradigm of the archaic world, it is now virtually certain that those unconventional thinkers and researchers have been correct all along, at least more so than the purveyors of orthodoxy. It is becoming obvious to a growing number of scholars, scientists, and researchers that there is far more to the story of human civilization on Earth than admitted in our textbooks or in the gilded halls of academia. Perhaps it's understandable that it's a psychological challenge for the defenders of orthodoxy to accept the far-reaching implications of this impending paradigm shift. The linear view of time and history upon which prevailing models of the past are constructed is an intrinsic part of and serves to reinforce the hierarchical structure of political and economic power that now dominates the social and cultural institutions of the 21st century civilization. But this worldview is obsolete, and as a matter of fact, dangerously so. It is this mindset which is at the core of America's project of global imperialism and its program of full-spectrum dominance, through which a self-appointed cadre of political and economic elites intend to effectively gain control of planetary resources. America's geopolitical philosophy has provided the rationale upon which a far-flung global military empire has been constructed. And ultimately, what's at the core of this philosophical rationale for pursuing this multi-trillion-dollar project is an obsolete zero-sum Malthusian worldview. In other words, we could put it this way: if we don't seize control of vital but finite and diminishing planetary resources, our enemies and competitors will do so, and we'll lose out. But in the name of preserving America's access to wealth and prosperity, those assets are instead being squandered and sacrificed upon the altar of perpetual conflict, whose outcome is imagined by its deranged architects to be planetary resource dominance. I reject this worldview. I would argue that we need to think big, that we must expand our perspective both temporally and spatially. And when we do, we will realize that the attempts to straitjacket evolving civilization through top-heavy bureaucracies, top-down command and control policies, coupled with the inevitable wars and conflicts required by these policies, are massively counterproductive and will only lead ultimately to oblivion, despair, and another dark age. On the other hand, we stand poised upon the threshold of a new space economy. This is not some New Age fantasy out of science fiction. The potential for civilization to expand into the cosmos with its infinite material and energy resources, for humankind to become spacefaring, is very real, and it could be well underway within one generation. It could be underway within a decade. And had we kept the momentum of the Apollo program, it would have occurred already several decades ago. However, the same constricted mindset operating to control and limit our understanding of the human past on Earth and the probability of former civilizations that may have existed and subsequently become lost to time and history is also at the core of the hegemonic goal of global resource control. It is also at the core of the attempts to impose political and economic dominion upon societies around the world in the name of preventing a contrived fossil fuel-driven climate crisis. Implementation of this agenda will require major control of global energy resources through all stages of utilization, from production through distribution to consumption. The imposition of net zero protocols will explicitly result in resource limitation, restriction, and the inevitability of energy rationing. The result will be social impoverishment. Meanwhile, due to the endless wars necessitated by a policy of global resource dominance, trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure investment will be destroyed. Infrastructure that required, in its creation, an enormous energy expenditure and will now require consumption of more energy resources on a massive scale to restore what has been destroyed. Or, alternatively, without reconstruction and the time and resources needed to accomplish the same, the people dependent upon those cultural assets will be deprived and driven into impoverishment. The environmental damage caused by unnecessary conflicts, for example, in the Ukraine and the Middle East, is not receiving the attention it deserves by mainstream media. The world is now reaping a harvest of unprecedented environmental destruction from these conflicts in these two theaters of war, and the environmental movement is missing in action. Instead, they're obsessing over an imaginary climate crisis. But let's consider the environmental realities of these two conflicts. Even in the early stages of the war in Ukraine, more than 30% of its protected areas, more than 3 million acres, which is much higher now, actually, because this is months ago, more than 3 million acres have been devastated by bombing and the resulting fires and pollution. Just over the first 4 months of the conflict, satellite surveys revealed more than 37,000 fires, most of which were ignited by shelling. Rivers are being poisoned by overflowing coal mines, damaged or destroyed sewage infrastructure and industrial facilities. Damaged pipelines are spilling oil that is poisoning wetlands. There is concern among botanists that already endangered plant species, which are native to specific ecosystems that are being adversely affected, could go extinct. In Gaza, the intense bombing undertaken by the Netanyahu regime, using munitions supplied by the utterly corrupt Biden regime, has, aside from the horrible humanitarian crisis, created an extreme environmental disaster. Roads have been destroyed, along with every hospital and school in Gaza. All wastewater treatment plants in Gaza have been destroyed and are now spewing toxins that are contaminating wells and groundwater. Desalination plants have been destroyed. Farmlands have sustained extensive damage. Air pollution from widespread fires and particulate matter from the bombing campaign are overloading the atmosphere. Thousands of human remains, countless thousands of human remains, are still buried and decaying under the rubble of collapsed buildings. Unexploded munitions are all over the place. Contamination by asbestos is widespread, and other hazardous materials are being released in copious amounts into the atmosphere. To reiterate an important point, think about the energy investment that was employed in building the infrastructure of Gaza, as with Ukraine, in the first place, but now, having been mostly destroyed, huge amounts of energy of necessity be consumed in its rebuilding. This is a colossal and immoral waste of energy, material, and human resources, and it must stop.